But what happens when the past you've tried to escape catches up with you? A chilling true crime story of lies, betrayal, and an unthinkable decision that spirals out of control. Stay with us to the end as the shocking twists reveal the dark truth behind a woman's desperate actions and the terrifying consequences she never saw coming. The room was quiet. Too quiet. A clock on the wall ticked faintly, its sound sharp in the silence. She sat at the kitchen table, her hands trembling. The envelope lay open in front of her. Inside was a single, crumpled photograph. Her husband stood in it, smiling, smug. Her jaw tightened. Her lover leaned against the doorway behind her. He smelled of cigarettes and gasoline. His voice was low, almost a growl. "Is it time?" She nodded, not trusting her voice. Outside, the night was heavy, thick with the scent of rain-soaked earth. The streetlights flickered. Her husband's car pulled into the driveway. She tensed, every muscle coiled tight. The front door creaked open. He called out, his voice sharp. "Where are you?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Footsteps echoed down the hall, each one louder than the last. Her lover stepped back into the shadows. She swallowed hard, her mouth dry. The air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on her. Her husband entered the room, his eyes narrowing. "What's going on?" She forced a smile, but it felt wrong, like a mask slipping. He glanced at the table, his expression darkening. "What's this?" Before she could answer, her lover moved. A blur of motion. A chair toppled over, crashing to the floor. Her husband shouted, his voice raw with anger. It turned to fear. The knife glinted under the harsh kitchen light. Her ears rang with the sound of his struggle, the grunts, the gasps. She couldn't look away, even though her stomach churned. The smell of copper filled the room. Her lover stood over him, his chest rising and falling. The knife dripped onto the tile, each drop a tiny echo. She stared at her husband's lifeless body, her mind racing. It was done, but the silence that followed wasn't relief. It was something darker. The kitchen felt colder now. She shivered, though she wasn't sure if it was from the temperature or something deeper. Her lover wiped the knife on his sleeve, the motion slow, deliberate. "You wanted this," he said, his voice steady. She nodded, but her throat was tight. The words wouldn't come. Her husband's body lay crumpled on the floor, one arm twisted beneath him. His eyes were still open, staring blankly at the ceiling. She looked away, but the image burned in her mind. The room seemed darker, the shadows deeper. A faint hum buzzed in her ears, growing louder with each passing second. Her lover grabbed her wrist, snapping her out of the haze. "Focus," he said sharply. "We need to clean up." She nodded again, her movements robotic. Her hands trembled as she reached for the bleach under the sink. The smell stung her nose, sharp and acrid. It mixed with the metallic tang of blood, making her stomach turn. She poured it onto the floor, watching it pool and spread like some unnatural river. The sound of scrubbing filled the air, harsh and frantic. Her lover worked beside her, his jaw clenched, his eyes cold. They didn't speak. They didn't look at each other. The minutes stretched, each one feeling like an eternity. Finally, the floor was clean, but the stain in her mind remained. She glanced at the clock. 2:13 a.m. They still had time. Her lover pulled a tarp from the trunk of his car. He spread it on the floor with a snap, the plastic crinkling like dry leaves. She felt her knees weaken as he rolled the body onto it. The sound was soft, muffled, yet it echoed in her ears. She looked away, biting her lip until she tasted blood. "Help me," he said. His tone left no room for argument. She crouched beside him, her hands cold and clammy. Together, they wrapped the body, each fold of the tarp feeling like a final goodbye. She felt his hand on her shoulder. "Stay strong," he whispered. But his touch didn't comfort her. It felt heavy, suffocating, like the weight of what they'd done. The night outside was still and silent, as though the world itself was holding its breath. They carried the body to the car, their footsteps soft on the gravel. The trunk slammed shut, the sound ringing out into the quiet night. Her heart raced as they climbed into the car, the engine rumbling to life. As they drove, the headlights cut through the darkness, revealing only the road ahead. She stared out the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. Her lover lit a cigarette, the flicker of the lighter briefly illuminating his face. His expression was calm, almost serene. It unnerved her. She closed her eyes, the image of her husband's lifeless body flashing in her mind. Her chest tightened. She had wanted this. She had planned this. But now, with every mile they drove, she felt the walls closing in. The car sped through the night, but there was no escaping what they had done. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a dark ribbon through the desolate night. She gripped the edge of her seat, her nails digging into the fabric. Her lover's hands were steady on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road. She envied his calm, but it made her uneasy. The smell of smoke from his cigarette lingered, mixing with the faint scent of blood still clinging to her. Her stomach churned. "You're quiet," he said, breaking the silence. His voice was casual, as though they were on a late-night drive, not transporting a body. "What's there to say?" she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. He chuckled, low and humorless. "You got what you wanted. That should feel good." She didn't respond. The car hit a bump, jarring her from her thoughts. The sound of the tarp shifting in the trunk sent a cold wave down her spine. She tried to steady her breathing, but it came out shallow and uneven. The headlights caught the edge of a dense forest up ahead. Branches loomed like skeletal hands, reaching for the car as it turned off the main road. The tires crunched on gravel, then dirt. The silence deepened, broken only by the faint hum of the engine. Her lover slowed the car to a stop. "Here," he said. They were in a clearing, the trees pressing in on all sides. The air was heavy, damp, carrying the faint smell of moss and decay. He stepped out, the door creaking loudly in the stillness. She hesitated, her hand on the handle, her heart pounding in her chest. "Come on," he said, his tone sharp. She pushed the door open and stepped out, the ground soft and uneven beneath her shoes. The darkness felt alive, the shadows shifting with every movement. Her lover opened the trunk, the tarp glinting under the pale moonlight. "Help me carry it," he ordered. Her hands felt like lead as she grabbed one end of the tarp. It was heavier than she expected, the weight making her knees wobble. They dragged it across the clearing, the fabric scraping against the ground. Each step felt like a mile. The forest seemed to watch them, the wind rustling the leaves like a whisper of judgment. He stopped suddenly and dropped his end of the tarp. "Here," he said, pointing to the ground. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The spot he had chosen was freshly dug, a shallow pit surrounded by disturbed earth. Her chest tightened as he tossed her a shovel. "Start digging," he said. She stared at him, her mind blank. "Now," he snapped. Her hands gripped the shovel, the cold metal biting into her skin. She plunged it into the soil, the sound of dirt shifting filling her ears. With every scoop, the weight on her shoulders grew heavier. Her lover worked beside her, his movements efficient, almost mechanical. The hole grew deeper, wider, until it was big enough. She stepped back, her legs trembling, as he unwrapped the tarp. Her husband's lifeless face stared up at her, pale and still. Her vision blurred, the forest spinning around her. Her lover's voice cut through the haze. "It's too late to turn back now." She nodded, but the words felt hollow. It wasn't just too late to turn back. It was too late for everything. He lifted the body with ease, the limp form folding unnaturally as he moved. She couldn't look directly, but every detail burned into her memory. The way his shirt clung to his chest, stained and torn. The way his head lolled to the side, as if in accusation. "Grab the legs," her lover barked. Her stomach lurched. She hesitated, her hands hovering in the air. "Don't freeze on me now," he growled. His tone snapped her back. She crouched, the weight of the legs heavier than she expected. They lowered him into the grave, the sound of the body hitting the dirt echoing like thunder in her ears. She stumbled back, nearly tripping, her breath ragged. Her lover didn't pause. He grabbed the shovel and began throwing dirt into the hole. The sound was unbearable. Each clump of soil hitting the tarp seemed louder than the last. She stood frozen, watching the grave fill, her chest tight with panic. "Help me," he demanded, his voice sharp. Her fingers trembled as she gripped her shovel again. She worked mechanically, her movements jerky and uneven. The grave disappeared inch by inch, swallowed by the earth. Soon, there was nothing left but a patch of disturbed soil. Her lover stomped on it, leveling the ground. "Done," he said, his voice flat. She stared at the ground, her mind spinning.
"Done."
The word echoed in her head, hollow and meaningless. But it wasn't done. Not for her. The weight of what they'd done pressed down on her chest, stealing her breath. Her lover lit another cigarette, the flick of his lighter cutting through the darkness. "You did good," he said, exhaling a plume of smoke. She didn't answer. Her throat felt like sandpaper. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the car. "We need to go." The ride back was silent. The radio stayed off, the hum of the engine the only sound. Her hands rested in her lap, caked with dirt and blood. She couldn't bring herself to clean them. The city lights appeared in the distance, but they didn't feel like home. Nothing did. He parked the car in her driveway, cutting the engine. The silence that followed was unbearable. "What now?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He turned to her, his eyes cold and calculating. "Now you move on." She blinked, his words cutting through her like ice. "Just like that?" she asked, her voice shaking. He smirked, his face shadowed in the dim light. "Isn't that what you wanted?" She opened her mouth to reply, but no words came. He leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. "You'll thank me someday." She flinched, pulling away. He laughed softly, a sound that chilled her to the bone. Without another word, he opened the door and stepped out. She sat in the car, her heart racing, as he disappeared into the night. The silence closed in, pressing against her chest. She stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror, her eyes wide, unblinking. For a moment, she didn't recognize herself. Her hands began to shake, a violent tremor she couldn't control. The car felt too small, the air too thin. She opened the door and stumbled out, collapsing onto the cold pavement. The sky above her was vast, endless, but offered no comfort. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she gasped for air. She had wanted him gone. She had thought it would set her free. But now, as the night stretched on, she realized the truth. She would never escape. She stayed on the ground, her palms pressed to the cold pavement, the rough texture biting into her skin. Her breaths came in shallow gasps, fogging in the chill of the night. Above her, the stars were distant pinpricks of light, indifferent and unreachable. The world felt too big, too empty. The weight of silence crushed her, her ears ringing with the phantom echoes of her husband's last moments. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling beneath her. The house loomed before her, dark and silent. It felt foreign now, hollowed out by what she'd done. Her hand shook as she reached for the doorknob. It was cold, the metal sending a shiver up her spine. She stepped inside, the air heavy with the faint scent of their life together, his cologne lingering in the hall, the aroma of coffee from the morning still faint in the kitchen. Her chest tightened, and she swallowed hard. The house was a tomb now, a place filled with echoes and ghosts. She moved to the sink, turning on the faucet. The water ran cold over her hands, washing away the dirt and blood. She scrubbed until her skin turned raw, the soap stinging like a punishment. But no matter how much she washed, she couldn't shake the feeling. The filth clung to her, invisible but inescapable. She looked up at the mirror above the sink, her reflection pale and gaunt. Her eyes were rimmed with red, her lips cracked and dry. This wasn't her. Or maybe it always had been. The clock on the wall ticked loudly, each second a sharp reminder of the passing time. She wandered into the living room, her footsteps soft on the hardwood floor. The photographs on the mantel seemed to mock her, smiling faces, happy moments frozen in time. One of them caught her eye. It was from their wedding day. Her husband's arm was wrapped around her waist, his smile broad and confident. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. The frame felt heavy, the glass cold against her skin. Her grip tightened. With a sudden burst of anger, she hurled it across the room. It shattered against the wall, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The shards scattered across the floor, glittering in the dim light. She sank to her knees, her chest heaving. The tears came hard and fast, burning hot trails down her cheeks. She pressed her hands to her face, her sobs muffled and ragged. In the silence that followed, the weight of her actions bore down on her like a crushing tide. She had wanted freedom, but instead, she had shackled herself to this moment forever. The house was suffocating now, its walls pressing in on her. She stood abruptly, her movements jerky. She couldn't stay here. Not tonight. Grabbing her coat, she stepped outside into the cold night air. The streets were empty, the quiet unsettling. Her feet carried her forward, aimless, each step echoing in the stillness. The city was asleep, but her mind raced. Her lover's words played on a loop in her head. Move on. She laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and broken.
Move on? How could she?
Her hands clenched into fists as she walked faster, her breath puffing out in short bursts. The streetlights flickered above her, casting long, distorted shadows. She didn't know where she was going, and she didn't care. All she knew was that she couldn't stop.
Not yet.
Not ever. The city unfolded around her, silent and eerie, as if holding its breath. Her footsteps echoed against the empty streets, the sound sharp and hollow. The buildings loomed tall, their windows dark and watchful. She turned a corner, her heart racing, unsure of where she was headed. Each step felt heavier, as though the weight of the night clung to her ankles. A faint hum of neon lights flickered up ahead, drawing her like a moth. She approached a small diner, its sign buzzing faintly, casting a pale blue glow. It was the only thing alive in the dead of night. She pushed open the door, the bell above jingling softly. The warmth inside hit her like a wave, carrying with it the scent of stale coffee and fried food. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her face weary but kind. The woman glanced at her, eyebrows furrowing slightly at her disheveled state. "Take a seat," the waitress said, her voice flat, indifferent. She nodded, sliding into a booth near the window. Her reflection in the glass stared back at her, haunting and unfamiliar. The waitress approached, holding a coffee pot. "Rough night?" she asked, pouring without waiting for a response. She wrapped her hands around the mug, the heat seeping into her cold fingers. "You could say that," she muttered, her voice barely audible. The waitress lingered for a moment, as if expecting more. When none came, she walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. The coffee was bitter, but she drank it anyway, the warmth spreading through her chest. Her mind replayed everything in vivid detail, the sound of his voice, the weight of the tarp, the dirt on her hands. The diner's soft hum couldn't drown out the chaos in her head. Her lover's face flashed in her mind, his smirk, his calmness. How could he move on so easily? Her hand tightened around the mug, her knuckles white. She thought she knew him. She thought she could trust him. But now, sitting here in the stillness, doubt crept in. The way he handled everything, so calculated, so practiced. It didn't feel like it was his first time. Her stomach churned at the thought. Was she just another pawn in his game? The door jingled again, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. A man walked in, his face obscured by the shadow of his hat. He paused, scanning the diner, his gaze landing on her for a fraction too long. Her pulse quickened. He moved to the counter, his back to her, but she couldn't shake the unease that settled in her chest. The waitress served him, her demeanor as detached as before. But her instinct screamed that something was wrong. The man's posture was too rigid, his movements too deliberate. She lowered her gaze, trying to steady her breathing. The mug trembled in her hands. Her heart pounded as she reached into her coat pocket, feeling for her phone. Her fingers brushed against the cold metal of something else. She froze. It was the small pocket knife her lover had given her weeks ago. Just in case, he had said with a grin. Her grip tightened around it now, the memory sending a shiver down her spine. The man at the counter shifted, glancing over his shoulder. Their eyes met. And in that moment she knew. He wasn't just some stranger. He was here for her. Her breath caught in her throat. The man's gaze lingered, piercing and unwavering. Her fingers gripped the knife in her pocket, the sharp edges pressing into her palm. He turned back to the counter, but the tension in his posture remained. She forced herself to stay still, her mind racing.
Who had sent him?
Her lover? Had he decided she was a liability? Her husband's family? Someone must have noticed his absence by now. The possibilities swirled in her head, each one worse than the last. She reached for her coffee, her hand shaking so badly that it spilled onto the table. The waitress looked over, frowning slightly, but said nothing.
She needed to act.
She couldn't just sit there, waiting for whatever was coming. Her eyes darted to the door, calculating the distance. Could she make it outside before he stopped her? The man shifted again, his body turning slightly, as if he could sense her thoughts. Her pulse thundered in her ears. He stood up slowly, leaving a few bills on the counter. Her heart leapt into her throat as he began to walk toward her booth. Each step echoed loudly in the quiet diner. She tightened her grip on the knife, her knuckles white. He stopped at the edge of her table, his shadow falling over her. "You dropped something," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. She blinked, her throat dry, as he held out her phone. It was scratched, smudged, but unmistakably hers. She hadn't even noticed it slip from her pocket. Her fingers hesitated before taking it. "Thanks," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. The man gave her a lingering look, his dark eyes unreadable. Then he nodded and turned, walking out the door without another word. The bell jingled softly as it closed behind him. Her entire body slumped in relief, the knife slipping from her fingers onto the booth seat. But the reprieve was short-lived. She knew it wasn't over. Whoever he was, his presence wasn't random. He was watching, maybe waiting. Her phone buzzed in her hand, jolting her back to reality. She stared at the screen, her stomach dropping. A message from her lover. "You're not safe there. Leave now." Her breath quickened, her head snapping toward the diner's window. The man was standing across the street, just beyond the glow of the streetlights, his outline barely visible. She could feel his eyes on her, cold and predatory. Her lover's message flashed again, another line appearing beneath the first. "Trust no one.
Not even me."
Her blood ran cold. The air around her seemed to thicken, the walls of the diner closing in. She slipped the knife back into her pocket, her movements deliberate and slow. Standing, she left a crumpled bill on the table and walked toward the door. Her steps were steady, but her heart felt like it might burst. As she pushed open the door and stepped into the night, she felt the man's presence like a weight on her chest. The cold air bit at her skin, but she didn't stop. She walked past him, her head held high, her gaze fixed ahead. But every fiber of her being screamed that he was following. She didn't dare look back. The night pressed in around her, every sound amplified in the silence. Her footsteps echoed on the pavement, the rhythm steady, calculated, but her heart raced erratically. She could feel his presence behind her, a shadow at the edge of her awareness. Her breath was shallow, each exhale visible in the cold air. The streetlights flickered overhead, casting uneven light on the cracked sidewalk. She reached into her pocket, her fingers brushing the knife. It felt small, almost useless, but it was all she had. She passed an alley, its darkness yawning like an open mouth. For a fleeting moment, she considered running into it, losing herself in the maze of shadows. But instinct held her back. He would expect that. She turned a corner, her pace quickening, her eyes scanning for an escape. A bus stop loomed ahead, its bench empty, the glass enclosure smeared with graffiti. She hesitated, her mind racing. Would it be safer to wait there, surrounded by light, or keep moving into the dark unknown? The faint sound of footsteps behind her made the decision for her. She kept walking, her legs trembling with the effort. A convenience store appeared up ahead, its fluorescent lights glaring and harsh. She pushed through the door, the bell jingling sharply. The cashier looked up, a young man with tired eyes and headphones around his neck. She forced a smile, her throat dry. "Just browsing," she murmured, stepping deeper into the store. The aisles felt claustrophobic, the shelves looming high around her. She ducked into one, pretending to study the rows of snacks. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she glanced toward the front. The man had stopped outside the store, his silhouette visible through the glass door. He didn't come in. He just stood there, waiting. Her hands clenched into fists, her nails digging into her palms. She needed to think, to act, but her mind felt sluggish, weighed down by fear. The cashier called out, his voice casual. "Everything okay?" She turned to him, forcing another weak smile.
Fine.
"Just taking my time." Her eyes darted to the back of the store. There was an exit sign above a door, its red glow faint but unmistakable. She moved slowly, trying not to draw attention, her footsteps muffled by the cheap linoleum floor. The door creaked as she pushed it open, the sound loud in the quiet store. The alley behind the store was dark and narrow, the air thick with the smell of garbage and damp concrete. She stepped out, letting the door swing shut behind her. Her chest heaved as she scanned her surroundings, searching for any sign of movement. The alley stretched in both directions, empty but for the faint hum of a distant generator. She chose a direction and started walking, her movements quick and purposeful. The city seemed to close in around her, the towering buildings blocking out the sky. She turned another corner, her steps faltering. He was there, standing in the middle of the alley, his face still obscured by shadows. Her breath caught, her body freezing in place. "Why are you following me?" she demanded, her voice trembling. He didn't answer. He took a step forward, the faint crunch of gravel echoing in the narrow space. Her hand flew to her pocket, gripping the knife with trembling fingers. "I'll use it," she warned, pulling it out and holding it in front of her. The blade caught the faint light, gleaming ominously. The man stopped, his posture shifting slightly. Then, in a voice low and chilling, he spoke. "You're not who he thinks you are." Her mind reeled, the words striking like a blow. Before she could respond, he turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving her alone in the suffocating silence. The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp, slicing through her thoughts. Her grip on the knife tightened, the metal biting into her palm. "You're not who he thinks you are." The phrase played on a loop in her mind, each repetition twisting her stomach into tighter knots.
Who is this man?
And what did he mean? She strained her ears, listening for any sign of his return. But the alley was silent now, the shadows swallowing every sound. Her legs felt weak, but she forced herself to move, her steps unsteady. Every corner she turned felt like a trap, every shadow a threat. She couldn't go back to her house. She couldn't trust her lover. And now, she couldn't trust herself. The city felt alien, the once familiar streets now a labyrinth of danger. She spotted a bench under a dim streetlight and collapsed onto it, her body trembling. The cold seeped through her coat, but she didn't care. Her mind raced, searching for answers, for a plan, for anything to make sense of the chaos. Her phone buzzed again, the sound startling her. She fumbled to pull it out, her hands slick with sweat. A new message from her lover lit up the screen. "Where are you?" She stared at the words, her heart pounding. Her thumb hovered over the keyboard, but she didn't type. Could she trust him? The doubts that had been simmering all night erupted into full-blown panic. What if he was setting her up? What if this had been his plan all along? Her phone buzzed again. "Don't make me come looking for you." Her breath hitched, her chest tightening. The words felt like a threat, laced with a control she hadn't noticed before. She shoved the phone back into her pocket, the action almost defiant. Her gaze darted around the empty street, searching for any sign of movement. She needed to disappear, to vanish before anyone else could find her. Her feet carried her toward the nearest subway entrance, the stairwell descending into darkness. The hum of a distant train echoed faintly as she hurried down the steps. The platform was nearly empty, save for a homeless man slumped against the wall and a young couple engrossed in their phones. She kept her distance, her back to the tiled wall, her eyes scanning every face. The train screeched into the station, the doors sliding open with a hiss. She stepped inside, choosing a seat near the back, her body angled to watch the door. The car was mostly empty, the fluorescent lights flickering overhead. As the train lurched forward, she finally let herself breathe. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks was almost soothing, drowning out the noise in her head. But her reprieve was short-lived. She felt it before she saw it, a presence, heavy and unshakable. Her eyes darted to the window, catching the faint reflection of someone standing near the door. It was him, the man from the diner, from the alley. Her blood ran cold, her body stiffening. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stood there, his gaze fixed on her. Her fingers found the knife in her pocket again, gripping it tightly. The train plunged into a tunnel, the lights flickering out for a moment before returning. When they did, he was closer. Her heart slammed against her ribs, her pulse deafening in her ears. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice breaking. He tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "You already know," he said softly. The train screeched again, the lights flickering once more. And when they stabilized, he was gone. The door at the far end of the car swayed slightly, as if someone had just passed through it. Her body trembled, fear gripping her like a vice. She had to end this, one way or another. The train's rhythm began to feel like a countdown, the steady clatter of the tracks only amplifying the urgency in her chest. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she watched the door at the end of the car, waiting for him to appear again. But there was nothing. The car was eerily quiet, except for the distant hum of the train moving through the dark tunnel. She took a shaky breath, trying to calm her racing heart. Maybe he had left. Maybe it had all been in her head. But she knew better than to believe that. Her fingers curled around the knife in her pocket, the cold metal grounding her in the moment. She couldn't trust anyone, not even herself anymore. The train passed through another tunnel, the lights flickering once more. When they returned, she glanced up again, her eyes immediately locking onto the far door. He was there. He stood in the doorway, his face half hidden in shadow, his eyes locked on hers. He hadn't moved, hadn't taken a step forward. He was waiting. Her pulse quickened again, her breath catching in her throat. She couldn't look away, couldn't break the connection.
She had to act.
but her body wouldn't move. It was as if he had frozen her in place, with nothing but the tension between them filling the space. She could hear his slow, deliberate breathing from across the car, every exhale a reminder of how close he was. The world seemed to close in, the walls of the train car narrowing, the space between them shrinking with every passing second. And then, without warning, he stepped forward. His movements were fluid, silent, as if he'd become part of the shadows themselves. She jumped to her feet, her legs unsteady, panic surging through her veins. She backed toward the door, her eyes never leaving him. "Stay away from me," she said, her voice trembling but firm. He didn't answer. He didn't need to.
He was too close now.
Too close to escape. The knife felt small in her hand, useless against whatever power he held over her. Her heart pounded as she tried to steady her breath, but the fear kept twisting in her chest, knotting tighter. The train passed another station, the lights flickering once again, and for a moment, she thought she might be free. But when the lights returned, he was gone. The car was empty. Her breath caught in her throat, the silence deafening. She looked wildly around, her hands shaking, but there was no sign of him. No footsteps. No shadows. Just the hum of the train and the faint, empty sound of her own heartbeat. She lowered the knife, her mind still racing. What was happening? Had it all been a game? Or was she truly losing her grip on reality? The train slowed, approaching another station. Her heart skipped a beat as the doors slid open, revealing the bustling platform. She stepped off the train without thinking, her feet carrying her onto the platform, away from the safety of the car. The station was crowded, the noise of commuters muffling the chaos in her head. She didn't care. She had to keep moving. She pushed through the crowd, her mind fixed on one thing: escape. The man wouldn't stop until he had her. She could feel it, and in the back of her mind, she couldn't help but wonder, was he only a shadow of what she had created? Or had he been following her all along? The crowd surged around her, people oblivious to the fear that gripped her every step. She pushed forward, her heart pounding in her chest as she hurried toward the exit. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed, their harsh glow flickering as if the entire world were starting to fray at the edges. Her hands were clammy, slick against the fabric of her coat. The thought of stopping, of standing still, seemed impossible. She had to move. She had to get away. As she reached the street, the cool night air hit her face like a slap, a brief reminder that she was still alive. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself, but her pulse refused to slow. The city felt vast, disorienting, its streets unfamiliar and yet suffocating in their sameness. She turned down another alley, her footsteps quick, her mind racing.
She needed to think.
She needed to plan her next move. But every thought was tangled, every memory twisted by the fear that had taken root in her chest. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her spiraling thoughts. "Where are you?" The message from her lover flashed on the screen, the words sharp and insistent. She stopped in her tracks, staring at the phone. His words felt like a threat again, an unspoken warning. But what was she supposed to say? How could she answer him? The phone buzzed once more. "I'll find you." Her breath hitched. The feeling of being hunted surged through her, consuming every ounce of clarity she had left. The streets seemed to narrow, every face around her turning into a blur, every corner a potential trap. She felt eyes on her, someone, somewhere, watching her every move. A car passed by, its headlights briefly illuminating the alley, and for a moment, she thought she saw the man's figure standing in the shadows. But when the car was gone, so was he. The panic rose again, choking her, making it impossible to think clearly. She had to get out of the city. She had to leave everything behind, her lover, her past, the lies that had brought her here. She couldn't trust anyone. The phone buzzed again, louder this time. You can't run forever. She squeezed her eyes shut, the words echoing in her head like a warning. Her feet carried her forward, driven by nothing but the desperate need to escape. But the city seemed to close in around her, every street and every corner leading to another trap. And somewhere, deep in the pit of her stomach, she realized she wasn't running from him. She was running from herself.
T.
The truth that she had buried beneath her lies, beneath her actions, was catching up to her. And there would be no escape from that. The air around her was thick with tension, the silence broken only by the distant sounds of the city. She could feel the weight of her own thoughts pressing down on her chest, suffocating her as the world spun out of control. She kept moving, her steps robotic, her body aching with exhaustion. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every face she passed felt like a potential enemy. Her phone buzzed again, but this time she didn't dare look at it. She already knew what it would say. "I'm coming for you." The words haunted her, the unshakable knowledge that there was no escape. She had done something terrible, something unforgivable, and now she would have to pay for it. Her mind flashed back to the night it all began. The argument with her husband. The cold, calculated decisions she'd made in the heat of her desperation. The lies she'd told, the promises she'd broken. She thought of her lover, his whispered promises of a life free from the chains of her marriage. But it had all been a lie. All of it. And now it was too late. She was in too deep. The streetlights blurred as she walked, her eyes fixed on the pavement beneath her. She had been trying to run from him, from her past, but in truth, she was running from herself. The thought brought her to a halt. She stopped dead in her tracks, a wave of realization crashing over her. There was no escaping the consequences of her actions. She could try to outrun her guilt, but it would follow her forever, an unrelenting shadow. And as she stood there, the cold wind cutting through her clothes, she knew the man wasn't the real threat. She was the one who had betrayed herself. She had wanted her husband gone, but in doing so, she had lost herself in the process. A figure emerged from the shadows in front of her, and her heart skipped a beat. The man stood there, just out of reach, his eyes locking onto hers. This was it, the end of the line. But as he took a step closer, she couldn't move. Not because she was afraid, but because she had nothing left to run from.